we've dehumanized this region in such a way to justify basically raping and pillaging it for centuries that it is understood, it is ingrained in the mind, in the imperial mind of the West, that those people are just violent and we're the civilized ones, even while we're bombing them, while we're slaughtering them in mass, we're the civilized ones.
And it's something that is baffling that we have a group of cultures that for 600 years managed to engage in such brutal violence and yet convince the world it's not them, but it's their victims who are the barbarians and savages. And worse yet, many of the victims have internalized that crap.
Everything is an accident. Nothing is actually being done. Every human rights organization on the planet, including human rights organizations in Israel, Israeli human rights organizations, they're all wrong. Everybody is wrong, but the state being accused of these things that you keep parroting. I mean, it's insane. And that's why, that's the other part that you can't process, right? I can't process the images of children being slaughtered, and I can't process this amount of gaslighting. It's like I can't even do it anymore. Like I've understood gaslighting now as through politics, not through relationships, but through politics. I now understand what it means to feel like you're actually going crazy because someone keeps denying reality to you.
The United States is an outgrowth. The United States is literally a congregation of all these crazy expansionist settler colonialists coming together, building a new society over there, and turning into one of the most hyper-violent groups of human beings we've ever seen in history. And I'm not afraid to say that. I really believe that.
Make America sane again. That I can read about politics in a different language, different information ecosystem, and hopefully find a little bit more hope than the English language media.
Mm. Good luck.
Probably you will find
Yeah.
new frustrations when you watch when you probably will find new frustrations when you watch the Chinese sphere of
Oh,
politics.
I have no doubt. I can see it in translation already.
Oh man. I mean, I also stopped reading the politics here in Hong Kong. I mean, I cannot handle that shit. The English language media. I mean, it's
Hmm.
so much CNN style coloniality over here. I cannot handle that stuff.
Well, a lot of
Yeah.
other countries' media take their cues from like the legacy medias and the corporate medias of the West. They really
Yeah.
just translate a lot of it and then publish
Yeah.
that.
Although
Yeah,
there was a
exactly.
great
That is.
example of something different. Remember when there was that derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, or whatever, Pennsylvania? And there was that
Yeah,
chemical spill, and there was a big
yeah.
story. So in the US, Pete Buttigieg came out a couple days after and said, "Hey, it's not that big of a deal. There's like 1,000 train derailings every year." And in the US, that was just kind of taken as like, "Oh, well, this guy's spitting the facts." In Hong Kong, I was in the gym one morning. I saw the local TV, the government channel, the public media, and they had that on there, Pete Buttigieg, and they were shocked. Like, what? A fucking 1,000 train derailment? That's just a normal thing in this country?
Well, you know what? I was just talking to my girlfriend yesterday about the fact that she knows, and she knows like the details of the CEO that got shot,
Mm,
but she hardly hears anything about what's happening in Palestine. And I'm like,
mm,
how can you be in China where you're pretty much the counterweight, so-called counterweight of imperialism, and you actually have the same news as in the United States? That is, you hide everything that happens in Palestine and you talk about all that nonsense crap that is much less important. And like, why is Hong Kong doing that? Why is China doing this? Why are you not reporting more on the shit that Western imperialism is doing? Like you just copy identical the news items of CNN and all that crap. It's just
mm.
so frustrating to me.
What's her media diet?
Pardon?
What's her media diet?
I don't know, just some Chinese media stuff that you can read here. So she goes on Redbook and she uh, I don't know what the WeChat, all these areas where Chinese people get their media stuff, and
Mm,
uh, and it's just like, yeah, that CEO of course is being shared a lot, CEO being shot just like in the United States. Israel Palestine, total silence. And like if you are
mm.
smart in China, you actually flip that. You show what empire is doing there in West Asia and how bad that is for the world. But China just has still no idea how to do counter propaganda. They just don't get it. They send their kids to Ivy League schools and import all these English language stupid pro neoliberalism books in political science and economics. And like, serious man, what are you
Yeah.
doing?
I mean, yeah, that's the thing is a lot of it, like I said, is just if you think about it, a lot of the ways that and this is true of like the sort of economic system as well. A lot of the ways that the US is able to sort of maintain hegemony is through the fact that it's created certain institutions that um that are hard to replace, right? They're intentionally it's very difficult to like if you wanted to compete with in a global media kind of way, it would be difficult to do so, starting with the fact, and this is a very basic fact, that a lot more people speak and understand English, right?
Yeah.
Just that fact alone. People are not um, consuming media in other languages when they're Americans or when they're English speakers, but other people in other countries are consuming American media because they understand English. We don't understand any other languages, and so we don't consume any other kind of media. So there's these, you know, pillars built into the system that allow that sort of institutional dominance to maintain itself through the dominance of language, through the dominance of, I mean, when you have also the money to expend on certain institutions, once they become established, it's very hard to replace it. So it's the same thing when you have, if you look at the economic system, and I don't understand the economic system, so I'm not going to pretend to, but I'm going to tell you what economists have told me in terms when I ask something like, will BRICS really challenge the dollar, or will this challenge, dollar hegemony or the US economy in any way? Will these other countries be able to sort of reverse the sanctions that only the US unilaterally can wield, right? It has the power to unilaterally do this. And the response is often, well, probably not in the near future, but also it's very difficult to replace those systems because they are now global systems. And so you can't just come in and say, okay, we're just going to do it differently all of a sudden because they've been established in a certain way and it's just not as easy to do so. And I think that's where you get the repetition and the cycles and the fact that foreign press, for instance, just pick up whatever you hear in Associated Press, right? The BBC, the New York Times, these sort of uh, legacy medias that are recognized globally. What are non-Western, besides Al Jazeera? I think Al Jazeera is the the one exception I can think of that is a globally recognized media organization that is not Western.
Yeah. That's pretty
Well,
much
Hong
it.
Kong does have its own native English language media, such as South China Morning Post, but probably they'll get their sources, of course, a lot from Western sources. But
Yeah.
I think Hong
AP,
Kong also has
Reuters.
the I think Hong Kong also has the problem that it's still not properly decolonized. And one of the issues, for example, I spoke to a senior professor at our university who literally said that. He said the problem is we over here we have not been not decolonized, so lots of our ways of doing things come straight from the British handbook. So, for example, how to deal with the kinds of structures you have in the university are all like carbon copies of the British system. And he said that's pure colonialism. And I think it also in the media system. I mean, it's so Western dominated the narrative. What do you think, Peter?
Well, I don't know about the Hong Kong media system or the Chinese media system
But I'm so
well
sorry.
enough. Hmm.
Peter, I want you to say what you want to say. I just want to,
Hmm.
because Kareem, you just mentioned the fact that Hong Kong has its own English language outlet, right?
Hmm.
So again, that's my whole point. A lot of countries do. A lot of countries have English language outlets, but the US doesn't have the same in reverse. Like, right, we don't have Arabic language outlets. We don't have Persian language outlets. We don't have China that I'm aware of, at least. Maybe we
They
do,
have
and I'm
they have
totally
Voice of
unaware.
America, the propaganda outlets in the other languages.
Well, that's theoretically not the same, right? Isn't
Yeah,
Voice of
yeah,
America
totally not the same.
funded by
Yeah.
the State Department, if I'm
Yeah.
not mistaken?
Yeah, yeah.
So that's why they have like the
Yeah.
different languages that they communicate in, because essentially they're communicating like US government talking points. But
Yeah.
so is most of our corporate media.
Yeah. Yeah, they just get it straight from the source. They don't have to have a middleman of a journalist.
Yeah,
But continue with what
yeah,
you're saying. So
yeah.
Oh no, I was
Continue.
just saying I don't know the Chinese media system, mainland system, or the Hong Kong media system well enough to be able to like give a breakdown of the different kind of ideological leanings. But certainly there's a lot of institutional memory and historical influence from the British system, without a doubt.
Yeah, and it plays so much into the hands of Western hegemony by actually continuing the hiding the things that our media hides and exaggerating the things that our media system exaggerates. I mean, if you're standing in the MTR, the metro system over here, and you watch the news on one of those screens in the train, you see the same things that are being discussed in the West. And I'm just baffled uh, about the lack of coverage of Palestine, for example, what's happening in Palestine, and you just literally completely play into the dominance, you could say, of the West in this way. You know, it's
Well,
just baffling to me.
I don't really watch TV in the US or here, but incidentally, I will see the public media station TVB in the gym, and it seems like every day they have god awful footage from Palestine.
Well, good to hear that. Good to hear that.
I,
I
I
haven't
think
seen
that's
it.
because you can't avoid it to a certain extent, right? So that's the what the way that I think what both of you are saying can be reconciled is the fact that on one hand, I think the coverage is lacking given the gravity of what's happening. The fact that there are events that happen and you'll never hear about, like a journalist was killed yesterday with her entire family. There's just no coverage. This is the 193rd journalist that's been killed in Gaza. It gets zero coverage. The fact, or even when there is the coverage, right? It's whitewashed or inaccurate in a way. Right now, if you look at, Israel invading Syria, the word invasion is not used. The word
Hmm.
occupation, the references to the Golan Heights, none of that is talked about in that way. So and I think there's it's almost like they're happy, and by they I mean sort of the US government, the Biden administration and Western media, that there are so many things going on around the world that they can stop covering Gaza as much as possible. But to some extent, it's impossible not to, right? There's just too many. I mean, people are being killed. Dozens of people are being killed every day on a daily basis. Dozens of people are being killed. They're continuing to be starved. They're being ethnically cleansed from the north. This is genocide. I mean, you have the continuation of a genocide on a daily basis. So I think it's both at the same time. Some stories have to get through because they can't completely ignore it, because that would make it so obvious that for people who aren't taking such a critical lens, they might say, well, no, see, I am seeing stories about Gaza, but it's just enough where it's not capturing people's constant attention, and given the gravity of the situation, not nearly enough coverage. There is not nearly enough media coverage.
Hmm. I wonder if anyone's done a content analysis of media coverage around the world to see if the coverage is more episodic or thematic. Like, do they provide the broader context, or are they just looking at the individual episode and just telling you the facts of the individual thing that happened without tying it into the broader picture?
That is such a good question, man. That would be a great study. And you know what would also be a great study? Just investigating individuals themselves, like a social psychological study, their knowledge about what's happening in Palestine. Just get three,
Mm.
400 Hong Kong university students and just test them on their knowledge.
Mm. Yeah, could totally do that. Uh,
I would be interested in that because usually what people just think about Palestine is like, oh, that is some issue in the Middle East, completely stripped of its context. Like I had one student talking to me the other day who wanted to do a master's thesis on Syria. I was like, good, good, a mainland Chinese student even. I was like, okay, probably that person has a different conception of what's going on. And according to him, everything came down to an ancient clash between Sunnis and Shias. That's it. It's the ancient religious clash. I mean, we're talking about somebody from almost 2 billion people in China. If they have this kind of crap in their head, I'm very very disappointed of the counter narrative coming from the global south.
Well,
mm,
that's like Orientalism 101, isn't it? Like the entire idea that one of the frustrating things as someone whose parents are immigrants from the region is this constant depiction of the Middle East as a place of millennia old sectarian divides and struggle. Like that's the problem always. The problem is themselves. They're just the violence, right? It's almost there's a fetish in the West for violence in the Middle East. And what's never talked about is the immense amounts of violence that are imposed on that region by the West and have been so for centuries. We're not talking about the invasion of Iraq or a genocide in Gaza or just bombing the region at will whenever Israel and the United States want to do so. But the fact that this goes back centuries, so it's fascinating. They talk about sectarian divisions, for instance, in the case of a country like Iraq, right? It has different you have a Kurdish region, a Shiite region, and a Sunni region. Those regions were all part of the Ottoman Empire, and these people lived together for centuries. It wasn't just this. I mean, when you look at the spread of Muslim empires, to a certain extent, it's because people were able to. They weren't just constantly fighting with one another. Not to say that that wasn't happening. Of course, it was. The history is just like every other imperial history is mired in constant conflicts. That's not what I mean. But the idea that the violence is inherent to a culture. That is the image and that is the message that is constantly given. Muslims and Arabs, this is just their nature. They're violent, they're barbarians, they're savages, they're uncivilized, and that is the language of colonialism entirely, right? It's the exact same language that was used against natives of this hemisphere that I'm currently sitting on, right? This entire hemisphere that Europeans genocided because they were the civilized ones, right? The civilized ones are the ones carrying out the genocides, not the ones being genocided. So there's this kind of language, and none of that has ever changed. I think this is why I always hated the phrase post-colonialism. I never understood. I mean, I understand in academic world what that means, but like it doesn't really mean anything because colonialism never ended. Empire never ended. It just changed the way that I talked about things. And there's this idea that colonialists of 200, 300, 500 years ago were walking in and saying, we're going to kill everyone and take all your stuff. And that's not what they were saying. That's
I think
never been the language of colonialism. It's always been one of, we're going to help you. We're here to civilize you. We're here to give you our technology and our ideas and all of these things that,
save
you
your
savage
souls.
don't. What?
Save your souls.
Exactly, right? The religious context, the religious part of it, save your souls as well. So that's, to understand it that way, but you never hear the part where, what about the violence that's brought there? Why are there so many US military bases in the Middle East to bring peace to it, right? We failed at it then. You're the United States and you keep saying this is our mission. Well, you failed it over and over for decades. So maybe just get out and see what happens then,
But it's because
right?
they're
Everything
barbarians.
is painted as this is the way that it always was. And that's just not the case. Like it's so wild when you see these ideas that like look at Afghanistan or look at Iran or look at these countries before these like Islamists took over, right? This you've probably heard this kind of framing very often. Look what happened when these Islamists took over. So the problem is Islam, except for the fact that those societies were already Islamic. They didn't They've been Muslims for 1400 years. They didn't suddenly become Muslims. So what happened? Where did Islamism come from? What was it a reaction to? Why don't we talk about the fact that democratization movements in the region were undermined by guess who? The West, over and over and over again. So the entire narrative is so false. Every premise is so false that it becomes frustrating to, I deal with like headlines. Let me fix this headline, but I'm like, that's not, I'm just scratching the surface of the narrative problem. The narrative problem starts at the roots, and the fact that we've dehumanized this region in such a way to justify basically raping and pillaging it for centuries, that it is understood, it is ingrained in the mind, in the imperial mind of the West, that those people are just violent and we're the civilized ones, even while we're bombing them, while we're slaughtering them in mass, we're the civilized ones.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I
yeah,
would
well
say
said.
I would say post-colonialism. I think what they mean is post thinking in the framework of colonialism. I think that that's what they mean. That's why they call themselves post-colonialists, post thinking in the colonialist framework. But I understand what you mean. Um, I would even go a step further. I would say that the region is actually much less fractured according to sectarian, was much less fractured according to sectarian or ethnic racial lines than in the West historically. I think sectarianism and racialism is a uniquely Western thing, dividing people up by race, dividing people up by denominations of a religion. I mean, even Christians among themselves with just a slightly different denomination were bashing each other's heads in for hundreds of years in Europe. I think that that kind of sectarianism is a uniquely European thing that has been exported during colonialism and now also during neocolonialism and imperialism, because it's one of the best divide and conquer strategies that one can use. And if you see also historically the plurality and the diversity of the Muslim world, you can see that they did a much better job historically than the Europeans. And that's also one of the reasons why Jews were always pretty safe in the Muslim world. In fact, even Zionists admit that the golden age was in Muslim Spain, of the Jews. And and you can also listen to stories of local people such as um, Richard Medhurst or Kevork Almashan, who is a friend of the show, who often say like when you lived in Syria back in the day, we didn't even care. We didn't even know our neighbors or people around us what kind of religion they had or what kind of denomination they had. So you could that kind of real diversity that you see in many West Asian countries is something that is very absent in Western societies. In Western societies, people are always immediately when they look at you, just look at you, and you have some kind of ethnic diversity. They're immediately either where are you from, what is your background. It's so ingrained in the Western mindset to cut everybody up into different kind of groups of people. You know what I
Well,
mean?
yeah, I mean the West is wildly violent. That's sort of what I was trying to get at. It's like the premise, it's this sort of gaslighting that you see right now, like what the Biden administration does, like as they're killing people, they're like, this is self-defense. It's like, well, how can you kill 20,000 kids in self-defense?
Hmm.
Like that's just not, and no logical person would think that that's the case. But they can just use this language to say it. I mean, the West is incredibly violent. You want to talk about anti-Semitism? The Holocaust didn't happen in the Middle East. The Holocaust happened in Europe. Pogroms didn't happen in the Middle East. They happened in Russia. That's where the word comes from, right? Like this is it was happening in the white European world, because Christianity is not tolerant of any other religious point of view. Um, even if you look at the religious doctrine within, and I don't want to,
I
sort
would
of
say
dive
I would say
into.
Western Christianity, by the way. I would say Western Christianity.
That's what I was. So this is why I was saying I'm like within the religious doctrine, right? there's limitations to who is accepted. If you look at the actual religiosity, right? Now you can be an individual Christian, obviously not believe this, just like you can be a Muslim and not believe a million different things that are within the religion. But by their design, Islam is more accepting of other religions that are monotheistic, especially Christianity and Judaism, right? Because I mean, it's almost a consequence of having come later. Like you're just more accepting when you're part of the same religious tradition, it's easier to accept your predecessors. It's not, you won't accept the people who come after you because then if you accepted them, you would just convert, right? It's the same thing with Judaism versus Christianity. Christianity has a much easier time accepting at least facets of Judaism because Christianity is built upon Judaism than in reverse. So I think I'm getting totally away from the point that I was trying to make earlier about like the violence that comes from the West, specifically if you're talking about Europe, those are examples of anti-Semitism. But of course, there's the colonial project that wiped out an entire like native populations of a hemisphere of the planet. There's the Atlantic slave trade and the barbarity of slavery and what wealth was built upon basically the backs of African slaves on the dead bodies of natives. Like it's just an insane amount of violence. When you look at the colonial projects, the Victorian Holocausts of India, when people were being starved because the British were taking all of the food and sending it back to Britain and people were starving to death. Like it's just the amount of history that you'd have to go through to understand the depravity and the violence that has been imposed upon the entire world. It would require a lot more than the time that we have right now, and it would require an entire library. And by the way, if you go to a library, it's full of these stories. It's full of these books that talks about this amount of violence that we are talking about. And I haven't even scratched the surface of the violence on the earth, right? The fact that the US talks about China, the US is still by far the largest contributor to carbon emissions in the world. The fact that 90% of the world's nuclear weapons are between Russia and the United States. I mean, how much more violent can you be? How much more violence can you embody when you look at all of these different concepts and you put them all together?
Yeah, well said. You're speaking my language because that's basically the argument of my boy Voltaire, like 300 years ago. He was pointing out just how insanely, exceptionally violent and brutal and uncivilized European society was, and the little that he could learn about Arab and Chinese civilization, he would use as a kind of stick to beat Europe over the head with. But yeah, I mean, exceptionally violent. There's a great line in that Raoul Peck documentary. It was something like Europeans mistook superiority in arms for superiority in everything. And maybe other people around the world in colonial mentality did the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's that kind of a human tendency for Stockholm syndrome. I always say like the Western empires have a unique tendency. I- How can I say that? Are unique. There's a unique psychopathic, violent tendency that you see among European colonial powers and now the American-led global order. And that kind of willingness to engage in just such brutal psychopathic violence is something that just completely overruns their enemies. And you see it now with Israel. Israel has that typical European colonial psychopathic insane violence that most people cannot even comprehend, that human beings are able to do this to children, to innocent men, innocent women, doctors, handicapped people, journalists, helpers, just wiping every single human being off the earth as if it is a cockroach. This is such insane tendency to violence that most people cannot get, to the extent that even the people who resist, who fight against them, such as the resistance, such as Hezbollah, still after 1 year refuses to engage in that same kind of violence to fight back, just because they just can't do it. because they have different values, different morals. And it's something that is baffling that we have a group of cultures that for 600 years managed to engage in such brutal violence and yet convince the world it's not them, but it's their victims who are the barbarians and savages. And worse yet, many of the victims have internalized that crap and copy that kind of thinking that is both a part of Stockholm syndrome, it's indoctrination, it's a lot of psychological things that result in just a completely upside down world.
And to make one thing very clear, I wouldn't argue that that this tendency towards violence and conquest is completely asymmetric. Obviously, it has historically existed through uh, different empires from the East, from Central Asia, in any history where there are human beings involved. There's definitely the use of violence to subdue people. There's competition over resources. All of these things are part of it. But what we have seen in what's interesting about like our modern world is the fact that we live, if you look at most of human history, or not prehistoric, but the actual history when you have civilizations, um, we didn't have ideas like, democracy or like an actual representative government of an entire system of people, right? That's part of the Enlightenment, the scientific method, the Industrial Revolution. All of these things happen in the last 250, 300 years that create the modern societies that we're in now. So what's fascinating about it is this entire evolution of human thought. Remember, if you go back, everybody was not literate and educated and reading all these books and understanding all these things and learning all these things. Like this was not the way of the world. So we do live in a very exceptional era as compared to all other eras of human history. But what's interesting about it is we've gotten the language for these things. We know how to talk about it. But in reality, and this is, I think, the part that's so frustrating, is in reality, that's not what's happening, right? If you look at a monarchy, for instance, the monarchy didn't pretend like it mattered what you thought. They didn't care what you thought. That wasn't part of the system. The system and the culture was literally built around this idea that the closest thing to divinity is the king, that the king is ordained by God to rule over people, and that this was the hierarchy that you were born into, right? That was the thinking at the time. We've completely undone that thinking. The thinking, not these systems still exist, there's still monarchies in the world, but we've undone that thinking societally on a very large scale. But for me, what's interesting about it is it still seems like it's just rhetoric, right? All of the trappings of civilization, they will do away with if there's any threat to the system that allows the elites and those who have power and money to exist. Look at the reaction to the killing of the United Healthcare CEO. People are being killed in this country every day. Nobody seems to care. As soon as it's someone who has money, it's like this huge, it's like a breakdown of civilization. We have mass shootings in this country basically on a daily basis. Children are slaughtered in this country through mass shootings. There is no there what is thoughts and prayers. That's all anybody ever gets, right? But if you're getting to people who you're not supposed to be getting to, right, the elites, then suddenly the entire discourse and language around it changes. So it's just very interesting to see all of these sort of events play out. But I've seen so much coverage of that event of what is it, journalists or reporters being appalled at the reaction that people have had, right? Which is in many cases, people they don't care. They're extremely indifferent to the murder of this person
Or happy.
because they see it within a framing of a larger injustice. Um, and there's such a disconnect still, even when that event happens, they're not trying to understand it. They're still not trying to understand it. It's not a question of justifying Or it's the same thing that happens when you have like an attack like October 7th, right? There's no attempt to understand why something like that happens. The only attempt is to say it's either crazy people or extremists. That's it. That's the only way that they try to understand it. And if you try to have a conversation, if you try to say, well, let's try to get at why this happened, immediately you're called an apologist for something because you're not allowed to have that conversation. Because if you actually had the conversation, you'd have to talk about the roots, the causes. Why are we in this situation? Why are people so angry? No one ever wants, not no one. The elites never want to talk about that because it would affect the status quo. And they're the ones who benefit from the status quo. So you cannot have conversations that go to why people are angry, whether it's Palestinians who are occupied for decades or whether it's Americans who can't afford healthcare.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's an interesting corollary with with liberal thought. The idea that, all these universal values, people are capable of self-governance, etc. But it only applies to people who are at a certain level of civilization. So it just applies to Europeans. It doesn't apply to the rest of the world that they colonize. And the corollary that seemed to come out in what you were just saying was uh, everyone has the right to life and to be free from violence if you are civilized in the sense that you've succeeded in the system and you've become a CEO or amassed a lot of wealth. If you're just an average schlub, then, well, mass shootings happen. Can't really do much about that besides thought and some prayers. The guarantee of security is for the people that matter, just like liberalism in the 19th century was for the people that matter.
Yeah. Well, I would, um, and I don't know if you meant that, Asal, but I would push push back a bit on like we had severe violent cultures everywhere. Well, I don't push back on that. I agree with you. Brutal violence was pretty much part of societies all over the world. And I won't say that brutal violence is a uniquely Western thing. But what I do say, and I also wrote that in my latest publication, actually, on the psychology of capitalism and its origins and evolvement as a part of culture. I do I am on the side of scholars who say that European societies were uniquely violent, and along with some other expansionist colonialist societies such as Japan or such as the Mongols. So if you have low resource, high competitive societies, this in a society in a society like that, you have a cultural evolution that turns the people into exceptionally violent human beings. And I think Europe is just a very unique example of a hyper expansionist, brutal society that has literally colonized and subjugated the whole world. And I think in that sense they're unique. And
I
the
agree, by the way.
United States is an outgrowth. United States is literally a congregation of all these crazy expansionist settler colonialists coming together, building a new society over there, and turning into one of the most hyper violent groups of human beings we've ever seen in history. And I'm not afraid to say that. I really believe that.
No, I don't actually. So you're right. I didn't mean to say that. I was trying to make the point that while one can make the argument that obviously it's not like there are no these other empires or societies of the past or even right now don't display violence. Of course they do, right? I'm not trying to discount that because that would be well, it would be an inaccurate way of talking about it. I mean, for instance, if you talk about Islamists and violence, like, yes, that exists. I'm not going to deny the reality that that exists. But again, the point is to try and understand it. It didn't happen because they're Muslims, is the point. Like, that's the problem. The problem is the reasoning that is given. Um, and to your point, when you talk about not a lot of resources, like when you talk about Europe, well, lack of resources in space, lots of people, they want to figure out, well, that's why they become expansionist and uniquely expansionist, because one of the major events that you would obviously talk about is the discovery of the Americas, right? The discovery of an entire hemisphere that at least because when we look at history, one of the problems is we're looking at recorded history, right? But who is recording the history? Well, when you've killed everybody on a continent and you don't have the same access to that history. It's not that they didn't have histories. Of course they did. And yes, we have you know, Mayans and Incas, and we have the idea of all of these different natives within North America as well, so many different tribes. It's not to say that we don't have any access to that history, but we don't have it in the same way because it's been destroyed, starting with the people themselves. And that is certainly a unique, an exceptional amount of violence. And so I absolutely agree with you with the fact that it is exceptional. I think it starts with that slaughter, with that genocide, with having taken all of this land, then having taken slaves from Africa to then till that land. I mean, the amount of human suffering and death and destruction that was required, the ecological imperialism, right? The fact that you weren't just bringing people, you were bringing plants and animals that were not native to these lands either, and decimating the plants and animals, the flora and fauna that were actually here. All of that is wrapped up in a exceptional brutality. The irony of it being, of course, that again, they were the civilized ones. They were the ones that were coming and being greeted by savages.
Yeah, they were going to save souls and bring them closer to God. I mean, even the just the stories of
They did. They killed them all.
yeah, yeah, it reminds me of the story of I think Hatui, the resident, I think Taino resident of one of the early islands in the Caribbean that Spain colonized. Was captured and is being led to execution, and they brought a priest up to say, like, I can save your soul right before you die, and then you'll go to heaven. And he had just asked one question. He's like, "Are there Spaniards in heaven?" And the priest is like, "Yeah, there's lots of Sp." And he's like, "Nope, never mind. I'm going to hell."
Yeah, exactly. Well, it makes you wonder when you see what's happening in Israel and the total blind support of most Western political classes. It makes you wonder all the shit that happened for the past 600 years when we couldn't watch, all the when we couldn't see it, all the stuff that happened, man, in the colonies with children and slaves, and I mean, yeah, I this utter brutality that is so open for the world to see right now is still. I'm still not able to completely psychologically and emotionally process what I'm seeing.
Because it's unnatural. Like the anxieties that we feel, um, if you are following what's happening, if you're seeing these images every day, is because they're completely they're not, we recoil at scenes of violence, especially brutality against children. It's horrifying. And so, you can't, I don't think we can process it, to be completely honest. And it's, it's, I have said this over and over again, but as much as I'm not surprised, but I'm still shocked. It's like I'm not surprised because it's not like supporting unconditional, blind, zealous support for Israel is anything new. It's not. It's not like just bombing countries at will is new. It's not. Invasions, slaughtering people, all of this has been done many, many times before. But I think having seen it on this scale, this consistently for such a long time now, we're going into 14 months, just 14 months of endlessly hundreds of days of living the same horror over and over and over again. I'm shocked that we're still here. Like, it's unbelievable to me that the US is still defending this. It doesn't matter how many, it doesn't matter if it's UN experts, it doesn't matter if it's a UN commission writing a report saying that it's a genocide. It doesn't matter that the world's biggest human rights organization calls it genocide, that Holocaust experts, Israeli historians are calling it genocide, that they are collecting archives of data saying this is genocide, saying you have former Israeli defense minister saying Israel's ethnically cleansing the north. I mean, you have Israelis now telling you this is what's happening. And the US is in absolute denial. They reject everything. They reject every institution, every court, every human rights organization, every aid group. It's How can you possibly only be the ones who are correct? They said Israel has a 30-day deadline to address starvation and the fact that aid isn't getting in. Aid groups said that the situation hasn't improved. The US disagreed. Years, mind you, the same administration, the same Biden administration, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International in 2021 and 2022 both came out with reports also saying that Israel's actions constitute apartheid. Guess who rejected that? The United States. So you're telling me that this country does nothing wrong. They're not doing anything. Everything is an accident. Nothing is actually being done. Every human rights organization on the planet, including human rights organizations in Israel, Israeli human rights organizations, they're all wrong. Everybody is wrong, but the state being accused of these things that you keep parroting. I mean, it's insane. And that's the other part that you can't process, right? I can't process the images of children being slaughtered, and I can't process this amount of gaslighting. It's like I can't even do it anymore. Like I've understood gaslighting now as through politics, not through relationships, but through politics. I now understand what it means to feel like you're actually going crazy because someone keeps denying reality to you.
And Linda Thomas Greenfield says that her legacy at the UN is going to be America Cares.
I
Yeah, it's very terrible. Yeah, I've also I had this tendency in the beginning to like avoid looking at all these things because I was like, yes, it's bad for my mental health and all that stuff. But I've also I don't know why, but also something changed. I was like, yeah, if I do that, I'm just gonna deny the reality that other human beings are in, and so I do take some time to just watch, sometimes to just watch what's going on. I saw so many heartbreaking videos, man. Like, I don't know if any of you saw it, but I saw it yesterday of this little, maybe 1 year old or 8 months year old boy who is completely burned because of a bomb, still sitting in a diaper, laying down in a diaper, and just trembling because of all the pain. And all he can do is just mention a song about daddy and holding a fruit, a pomelo in his hand. And he's just, we're talking about a kid, maybe not even 1 year old, and just I think it's an automatic reaction of the brain to avoid focusing on the pain. So he just keeps repeating that little song about a pomelo and his father. It was so incredibly painful to see. Like it made me cry a bit. And I'm like, yeah, I can either just act like it doesn't happen and become normalize it in a way by just ignoring it, and I can't do it. I just force myself to sometimes watch these videos to see what the hell is going on, what people are suffering, and I'm so enraged and frustrated and like why are we not why are 8 billion people on this world not able to stop a 7 million country from doing this, plus 300 million country strong of the United States? It's just it's so incredibly reality destroying what's going on here. The reality that I thought that we had, it reshapes the whole understanding I had of the world. It's so reality shattering, this moment.
Hmm. I'm curious. I don't know if either of you know, but I've just been kind of waiting for at least the European left, which historically has been a little better organized than the US left, at least like on the average over the past half century or so. When is there going to be uh, enough pressure in European capitals to break away from the US-Israeli consensus and enforce the actual values and beliefs of people there? Have you read any uh, I don't know, read, heard from family members, etc., anything about the political developments there regarding the genocide?
I have to admit, Peter, that I really came to the conclusion that our left, shocking as it may sound, may even be worse than the United States left. I think neoliberalism and the third way leftists like Labour that we have in the United States, but of course also in the UK, those that kind of compatible leftism has really, really eroded real leftism in Europe. I mean, people like Alexander McKay, for example, friend of the show, that kind of leftists are so tiny, so marginal, like Marxists, socialists. It's even the ones who call themselves socialists are actually just liberal Democrats. And it's I when you see the narrative around Israel Palestine in Europe, I mean, we are run by Zionist governments. These governments are often, at least in the Netherlands, very popular. These Islamophobic Zionist governments, they're very, very popular. And there's the counterweight is so tiny. Like, for example, in the Netherlands, the most people who protest are minority group members. So all these all these Palestinian flags that you see are usually just Moroccan Dutch people. And white Dutch just to hardly mingle with that stuff because that is part of the whole identity culture war. If you are pro Palestine, then you're part of those immigrants, those brownies. It's and it's very sad to see. And what I also find very difficult to handle is that 14 years or 14 months later, like Miko Palet said, how come that after 14 months our resistance, our protest has not evolved? People are still blowing whistles and waving flags. And while it's important to keep the attention on Palestine, it is a bit baffling that it doesn't evolve in something more effective.
Yeah, what about over there in the US, Assal? Like what's your assessment of the protests, activists, the resistance there?
Uh, I mean, I think that you've if you look at last year, the last spring when you had, for instance, the student protests, I mean, the largest kind of impactful protests that we saw in the US were the campus protests in the spring. But those universities have largely figured out how to crack down on students in a way that makes it much more difficult for them to do so. You are seeing actually protests, I think, if I'm not mistaken, at NYU today. So we'll have to see how something like that goes. But I mean, making it, it's very difficult for students to participate in protests when they're being expelled, when they're being suspended. You have international students have basically been told, tried to they've tried to deport them in some cases, from what I've seen. You've had organized efforts by people in like the workforce saying that they want to know the names of these students, that they would never be hired anywhere. I mean, it's the amount of um the crackdown on it, I think, is the larger part of the story, because one of the things that I've tried to talk about, and I have a difficult time saying it because it feels like when I say there are other implications to what's happening in Gaza, that it somehow takes away from the fact, or anything is more important than the fact that there is a genocide, and that's absolutely not the case. At the same time, there are larger implications. Part of that, for instance, is this loss of free speech, the narrowing of space, the fact that you it's so much harder to sort of organize these things, and how effective are they? How effective are these protests in changing policy? Clearly, in terms of changing policy vis-a-vis Israel, they're not effective at all. It hasn't done anything for the Biden administration whatsoever. I mean, look, Democrats lost the election. They didn't even care. They didn't even care to try. Like, that's how deeply embedded they are in this idea. And it's not, they didn't lose the election because of Gaza. They lost the election for many, many reasons. The number one being the economy. That was the number one thing that people cared about. They were tired of probably being told, you're too stupid to know that the economy is actually really good right now, which is what they've been told. What we've been told now for a couple of years, everything's actually really good. You just don't understand that it is. And to me, the implications are how tied the elite and the status quo is to this particular foreign policy. Now, why is that the case? What are the different motivations for political actors who are working? What are we going to see from a Trump administration? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. I honestly don't know. He just seems like a very, very unpredictable person. I saw something today because he was selected as Man of the Year for, or Person of the Year, sorry, for Time Magazine. And I think there was a quote I saw someone share that he was asked if he trusts Netanyahu, and his response was, "I don't trust anybody." So even that is like, you never know what this person is going to do. But I don't know, in terms of effectiveness of protests and what we can do, I think at the very least we can't stop talking about it. We can't stop talking about Gaza. We have to keep talking about Gaza because it is a genocide that is occurring in real time. And if you're an American, it's with our tax dollars, it's with our weapons. I mean, Israel could not do this without US support. The implications for just international law institutions, they're clearly completely ineffective at stopping from anything like this from happening. We're really at an inflection point, as I think, as a global society. Just looking at things, if you take the whole picture into account, it's not just Americans that have deep grievances about the economic situation and the economy, whilst the wealthy are just getting more and more wealthy. Like, that's the part that people have to always remember. It's not, yeah, the economy everywhere is bad. Not if you're rich. Like, it's great for you. It just keeps getting better somehow. So, not somehow, like, we understand why that's the case, because wealth continuously gets concentrated, and that means there's less for all these other people to have. So I think we're just reaching a boiling point. And for instance, the events that we've seen in the US recently with the killing of a CEO, these are things that if the elites don't want to ever grapple with, then they're going to have to deal, they're likely going to see more resistance coming in different forms that aren't just, protests. Because when people see that it's ineffective, they start to get angry, they start to get frustrated. And I'm connecting all of these dots because the idea is there is a status quo that informs everything that is happening to a certain extent. And that is coming under question because people are becoming more and more angry at their own daily life. And if you're an American and you're struggling economically and you're seeing just billions and billions and billions of dollars going to Ukraine, going to Israel, going $1 trillion military budget when we're not being attacked. Like, this is the craziest part about it. It's all a defense budget. Who is attacking us? Who is attacking the United States? So we're spending $1 trillion to defend the country when it's not being attacked, whilst people in the country don't have food. Millions of people live in poverty. They can't afford healthcare. They can't afford rent. I mean, it's this combination of, I should say, lack of priorities that have anything to do with the well-being of the general public that I think is starting to see people act out in different ways. And that's why you're seeing so many people react what you're seeing in the death of the killing of a CEO. It's what did you expect? I remember a couple years ago there were protests in front of, what was it? I think Jeff Bezos' house, where people had like a mock guillotine. Very reminiscent of like the French Revolution and the phrase that's attributed to Marie Antoinette, like "let them eat cake." It's like we're living through a "let them eat cake" moment, and they're completely oblivious to it. They just think they can shame everyone into not feeling the way that they do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well said.
Pitchforks. I mean, the gun is the pitchfork, you could say, of that guy. That's that guy that shot the CEO. It's parallel to the pitchforks. Anyway, depressing times, but necessary to vent a little bit. So
Yeah.
that's why we have Assal to keep us a little bit sane
I'm just here to
over here.
vent. I don't have anything to contribute, but it's mostly to say, what are we doing?
Yeah.
What are we doing?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that was great, Assal. Thank you for keeping us sane, and
Yes, indeed.
we were probably gonna bother you again in the future to keep us sane again. And
Happy to. I mean, we're getting gaslit by our leaders, so at least maybe when we talk to each other, we'll start to remember what reality is like.
Make America sane again.
yeah, make the world sane again. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, thanks a lot, and talk to you
Guys.
soon.
Yes,
Sounds good.
indeed.
Bye.
Bye.